Hi everyone. So it's been a while since I made a video on domestic UK politics. Um, it's not that I don't have any interest in it, it's obviously important, but there's just a lot of things going on in the world right now, and my other videos have, I think, somewhat reflected that. Um, in one of the groups that I'm in, it's sort of a group where these sort of issues get raised quite a lot, although it covers a lot of other things. Anyway, the admin of that group on Facebook is a British Pakistani guy, and he is a real blue conservative. I think that's fair to say. I don't think he would mind me saying that. Um, and he raised an interesting question because there was a by-election yesterday, which the Tories lost to Labour in Tamworth, Staffordshire. And he raised the question of what is it that is costing the Tories popularity. So I think it's a good discussion topic. So as always, leave your comments, agree, disagree, share your thoughts. Excuse me. Um, I think it's worth considering a bit. Firstly, Tamworth. I don't think I've been to the town. I don't know that area very well, but I did live in the West Midlands for a while. I went to university in Wolverhampton. And a lot of the Midlands is kind of bellwether in the sense that it's not really blue or really red. Although historically it's an industrial, a lot of those areas are industrial, and so you'd expect them to be pro-Labour. It's it's a bit of a patchwork. So I don't know enough about Tamworth to say what the history of that town has been, but certainly other parts of the West Midlands, it's been of that region has been flipped from Labour to Tory on numerous occasions, whereas you get other areas that are reliably Tory or reliably Labour. The term safe seat is a little bit contentious because it actually implies that I know politicians themselves don't like using the term because it implies a complacency. Oh, we'll win the seat, it's ours anyway, kind of thing. Although, honestly, I think there is some of that thinking there with political parties. Um, to me, it's not a major mystery why the Tories' popularity is going down. And the first thing I would cite is what I would call generational fatigue. So if we look at pretty much the whole of post war British history, certainly my whole lifetime, it's been this kind of pendulum of power whereby the Tories will govern for a generation, then Labour governs for a generation, and so on. And it's been especially pronounced in my lifetime. So 1979, the Thatcher landslide. Um, she and Major are in power for 18 years, 1979 to 1997. Long time. Then New Labour, Blair and Brown, 13 years, 1997 to 2010. Then 2010 to the present, Tories. There was, of course, those 5 years of coalition government, but the Tories were the senior party, and really we could still call it a Tory-led government. So 13, almost 14 years. So I think they've now got to a point where it's that kind of generational fatigue where people say, we've given them a chance, let's go for the other side now. I think that's honestly part of it. Rishi Sunak has the disadvantage of being the fifth Tory leader in a row. Um, and rather than being something that should be seen as successful because they've maintained power for well over a decade, um, it seems that no matter what Sunak does, Labour is on course to win the next general election, which will be sometime, I assume, around summer next year. Um, and all the polls suggest a likely Labour win. Of course, Starmer would be wise not to be complacent on this. There could be some major scandal within Labour. There could be some major policy shift that the Tories come out with. Politics, things can change, but in all likelihood, Labour is going to win the next general election. It may not be a landslide, but I think they're almost certainly going to win. Um, so Starmer has the advantage of being an opposition leader at a time when people are tired of the government. Um, if we look at the opposition leaders when a popular new prime minister, i.e., Tony Blair, at that time came in, they had an almost impossible task. So you had William Hague, Ian Duncan Smith, Michael Howard, and just a succession of Tory leaders, and they just had no chance. because Blair was a very capable political operator. He was young, he was fresh. Um, Even after the Iraq War, which was the major shadow in the Blair government, even then he still won a general election. Teflon Tony. But I think that's true of any opposition leader. It was probably true also of Ed Miliband um, with David Cameron. Although Cameron I don't think he had quite the gravitas of Tony Blair in terms of election winning material. It was a bit closer. But the situation now, that's a big thing, this generational thing. But I also think the Tories, I think there's genuine public frustration with them. You could check any policy, and depending on someone's profession or background or traditional politics, they could cite a particular policy and say, I hate that policy, that's why I'm voting against them. But I'm not sure that any individual policy brings down a government. Possibly. I mean, you could argue the poll tax brought down the Thatcher government. But I think it's rare where one policy alone brings down a government. I think it's more a combination of things and a combination of feelings about that government. So, the Tories can afford to make some mistakes. Any government can, but rather it's a combination of things. And I think the truth is, this government, not necessarily the Sunak administration, but this Tory government, is associated with sleaze. It's associated with entitlement. An example of this is Partygate. Now, there are Tory members and Tory voters who kind of say, oh, they try to downplay it and they try to say it's a trivial thing, and there's bigger issues. In of itself, it seems trivial enough, but the optics of that are very important because ultimately what you had was a situation where the people who set the rules didn't themselves abide by them. Now that's unforgivable because it's corruption of power, and that is not a trivial issue. It actually, at its worst, can be a threat to democracy. Um, and I don't believe it got so far that our democracy was totally threatened because Johnson is gone. But Sunak wasn't squeaky clean either. Um, and I think there is one issue I have with the Tories, and I think this is a wide public perception. There's an arrogance there, this sort of entitlement to rule attitude. And of course, when these things emerged, there was always apologies and, we regret it and it was taken out of context. There's a lot of excuses. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, with Partygate, for example, there were people fined extensive amounts for doing the same thing. I remember a student, he held a lockdown party. He shouldn't have done it, but he held it, got fined £10,000. There were people who sacrificed, people who couldn't go to their family members' funerals because of the rules that the government imposed. So it was just one thing after another. Partygate was the culmination of it. But the other thing is, a lot of Tory members say that getting rid of Boris Johnson was what brought down the party's popularity. That may be true in some Tory circles. Certainly, I've no doubt there are Tory members who thought that was a terrible thing to do. He was the leader who won the general election, he delivered Brexit. So, and this is how he is thanked. But I think they're being short sighted because they're forgetting the rest of us, they're forgetting the wider public. Um, and I do think with Boris Johnson, there was something of a personality cult, not quite as extreme as that around Donald Trump or even perhaps Jeremy Corbyn, but it was there. And it was led by people like Nadine Dorris. It was like, how dare you question the great leader? There was a bit of a personality cult there, and I haven't seen that with any other prime minister in my lifetime, even Thatcher. I know Thatcher had some pretty die-hard supporters, but even I guess, I was too young in 1990. Maybe there were some who were saying the same thing, that they were traitors and they stabbed her in the back and so on. But I've never seen quite the same defensive attitude towards Boris Johnson as I've seen with fellow prime ministers. And it's very unhealthy. And it's tone deaf to public sentiment. So, any Tory members who think that the answer is to bring back Boris is utterly delusional. Because Boris Johnson, I would argue, was a big part of their problems in the first place. Yes, he delivered Brexit, so he got that done. If you voted for Brexit, he done it. That's an achievement from that point of view. Now, I didn't vote for Brexit. I'm not convinced it was a wonderful decision. It wasn't a disaster that, hardcore Remainers said it would be, but it was not the thumping triumph that the Leave side said it would be. It just wasn't. Whatever way they gloss it over, it wasn't. So he got Brexit done, frankly, doesn't mean a great deal to the almost half of the country who didn't vote that way. It doesn't mean anything. That's not a selling point for the rest of us. Many people who think it was a massive mistake. I'm not saying that's my view, but I just don't think it's a wonderful selling point. He got Brexit done. Well, good. That's good for hardcore leavers, but not for everyone. Anyway, I digress. Boris Johnson's associated with sleaze. He's seen as a liar, and indeed he has told barefaced lies. Now, you could argue, you could get into the stereotype, well, all politicians lie. But the thing about Boris Johnson, it's just a long track record of doing this. I mean, going back to his days as a journalist when he invented a quote, that's something you just don't do as a journalist. That's just bad practice. It's worse than bad practice. It's deeply unethical. He got fired for it, but that's his history. That's the man's history. I think he's been so successful because he is a character. He knows how to communicate in certain ways. But this notion that they got rid of him and that's what's cost their popularity. I can't think of any other prime minister who had mass ministerial resignations. And those people who jumped the boat, I don't think they were being traitors. I think they were putting country before party. They were recognizing that Boris Johnson was a liability, and they could no longer defend a prime minister who, frankly, was corrupt. Um, then we look at Truss's mini budget, tone deaf, utterly tone deaf, and she still has never expressed any remorse for that. Rightly or wrongly, that budget was seen as pandering to the rich and powerful at a time of cost of living crisis. What does that do? It taps into the stereotype that the Tories are a party for the rich. Now, I think it's maybe a little bit overly simplistic, but it doesn't help. Um, and it's also this question of, I mentioned Partygate, but there's one thing after another. Look at Suella Braverman and her numerous um, misdoings, so to speak. In normal misplacing emails, in in a lot of companies, has someone done that? A breach of the ministerial code or a breach of company policy, they would be fired. This woman gets chance after chance. Now, I happen to like some of the things that she's done. I happen to like some of her positions, but again, it taps into one role for them, another for everyone else. I do think Sunak, I feel somewhat sorry for him in the sense that I think he's picking up a lot of the problems of his predecessors. He's having to deal with it. He's the leader of the party, he's the prime minister, so he's having to deal up with a lot of the fallout from the mistakes made by his predecessors. And I don't actually think Sunak's an awful prime minister. I'd put him probably around average. I really don't think he's that bad. But he's being tied in with this tired Tory party. Um, but I give credit where credit's due. One thing that can be said for the last four prime ministers, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak, they've all been consistently tough with Russia. This is a very important thing. It's one of the major geopolitical challenges of our time. After Salisbury, May expelled Russian diplomats and their staff. That was the right thing to do. Um, Boris Johnson, showed unwavering support for Ukraine. Absolutely the right thing to do. Liz Truss showed hawkishness on that. The right thing to do, as has Rishi Sunak. It's right. And some people will question that, but I do look at foreign policy with leaders, and I think they've been right on that. China, not so much. Of those four, the only one I could say that has been consistently tough is Liz Truss. Actually, this is one thing about Truss. Say to someone on the street, Liz Truss, and she's almost a byword for political failure. But one thing I do give her credit for, she has been consistently assertive about China. She's never wavered on that. And when she made that visit a few months ago, people said it was a cynical ploy to keep herself relevant. Maybe it was. but it was also sending out a message that you know, we will not be intimidated by Beijing's threats when she visited Taiwan, I should say. Paradoxically, you have James Cleverly going to China. I don't see what he gained from that. It was all about dialogue and we need to work with China and we understand there. But frankly, it just looked like a strange decision. And I don't think James Cleverly is a stupid man. I think he's probably quite capable. But I think that was a bad decision and I don't know what he achieved. At a time when the Chinese state is engaging in huge espionage against this country, when there is evidence that they're intimidating Tory MPs who speak out, for example, members of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, that's a disgrace. I think it's enough to summon the Chinese ambassador and, if need be, expel him. And I know that dealing with China is more complicated than even Russia because of its economic clout, but we cannot have a situation where the Chinese see us as weak. I think we need to be much more robust. Sunak talked tough on the campaign trail, but it's been disappointing. He's watered it down, as has his foreign secretary. Um, I'm just not happy about the way that's going. But I don't think, honestly, the average person on the street votes on those sort of issues. I care about them because I'm interested in world affairs. But honestly, I think the average person isn't going to vote for a government based on their China policy. It's one thing I would consider, but the average person cares more about, and I'm not saying they shouldn't, they care more about bread and butter issues. Um, so there's a lot of factors. I'll close with this thought. I'll probably make another video at some point about Labour, but one thing about the Tories I do give them credit on, they are the only major party that doesn't play toxic identity politics. It's the only major party that stands up to woke dogma. Now, the left say you're playing culture wars with this. Conservatives, the right, critics like myself are playing culture wars. I think the cheek of that, because it is the left, the woke left who have been pushing, mandatory lessons in critical race theory in institutions like hospitals. This is empirically proven. It's happened. It is the left that is trying to police pronouns and potentially make it hate crime to use the wrong pronoun. Labour is mulling on that idea. It's Labour has been pandering to the likes of Black Lives Matter, which most people consider a deeply controversial movement group. Um, the Tories, to their credit, have consistently refused to toe the line with this. They've consistently refused, for example, to say that trans women are women. Now, people might say that is a trivial thing. Actually, this gets into some very important issues. It gets into freedom of expression. It gets into reality, actually, basic reality. And if people cannot tell the truth, if they're threatened with, losing their job, these are not trivial issues. So the left say the Tories are being cynical by talking about these things, but they have to talk about them because there has to be a pushback against that dogma. I, for one, am very grateful for the Tories for doing that. That doesn't mean I support them on other areas. I'm undecided who I'm going to vote for, but if I had one question for Keir Starmer, I would say, Mr. Starmer, well, I'd have more than one question, but one that I might ask is, do you believe in critical race theory? Do you believe that white children should be taught that they're inherently racist and minority children should be taught that they're perpetual victims? Because that is what that ideology promotes. I think it's toxic. And the Tories, to their credit, are the only party that stood up for that, but clearly it isn't enough to, stem the tide. So I think there's a lot of things that are going against the Tories. I think the perception of sleaze and entitlement. I think the generational thing, that they've been in power for so long. Let me know your thoughts. What is it? Why are the Tories struggling right now? Specifically, what do you think it is? I think Starmer, to his credit, has done a lot to detoxify Labour in the way that David Cameron detoxified the nasty party image of the Tories, although I'm not sure that he fully did, because there was nothing compassionate about their war on the unemployed in the early 2010s. That ghastly poster, Strivers versus Scroungers, I think it was very, very cynical. So, the big society was a bit of a facade. I never really bought it. But nevertheless, he did make the Tories a lot more diverse to his credit, um, without going for shortlists. Um, Keir Starmer has worked hard to detoxify the Corbyn image. I give him credit for that. But I still associate Starmer with woke dogma, and I still think he's pandered to it. So I'm not convinced fully about Starmer's Labour, but we'll see. Let me know your thoughts about the Tories' decline in popularity.